The aesthetic dimension. It seems that art as art expresses a truth, an experience, a necessity which, although not in the domain of radical praxis, are nevertheless essential components of revolution. With this insight, the basic conception of Marxist aesthetics, that is, its treatment of art as ideology, and the emphasis on the class character of art, become again the topic of critical re-examination. This discussion is directed to the following theses of Marxist aesthetics. 1. There is a definite connection between art and the material base, between art and the totality of the relations of production. With the change in production relations, art itself is transformed as part of the superstructure, although like other ideologies, it can lag behind or anticipate social change. 2. There is a definite connection between art and social class. The only authentic, true, progressive art is the art of an ascending class. It expresses the consciousness of this class. Consequently, the political and the aesthetic, the revolutionary content, and the artistic quality tend to coincide. 4. The writer has an obligation to articulate and express the interests and needs of the ascending class. In capitalism, this would be the proletariat. 5. A declining class or its representatives are unable to produce anything but decadent art. 6. Realism in various senses is considered as the art form which corresponds most adequately to the social relationships, and thus is the correct art form. Each of these theses implies that the social relations of production must be represented in the literary work, but not imposed upon the work externally, but a part of its inner logic, and the logic of the material. This aesthetic imperative follows from the base superstructure conception. In contrast to the rather dialectical formulations of Marx and Engels, the conception has been made into a rigid schema, a schematization that has had devastating consequences for aesthetics. The schema implies a normative notion of the material base as the true reality and a political devaluation of non-material forces, particularly of the individual consciousness and subconscious and their political function. This function can be either regressive or emancipatory. In both cases, it can become a material force. If historical materialism does not account for this rule of subjectivity, it takes on the coloring of vulgar materialism. Ideology becomes mere ideology in spite of Engels' emphatic qualifications, and if devaluation of the entire realm of subjectivity takes place. A devaluation not only of the subject as ego cogito, the rational subject, but also of inwardness, emotions, and imagination. The subjectivity of individuals, their own consciousness and unconscious, tends to be dissolved into class consciousness. Thereby, a major prerequisite of revolution is minimized, namely, the fact that the need for radical change must be rooted in the subjectivity of individuals themselves, in their intelligence and their passions, their drives, and their goals. Marxist theory succumbed to that very reification when it had exposed and combated in society as a whole. Subjectivity became an atom of objectivity. Even in its rebellious form, it was surrendered to a collective consciousness. The deterministic component of Marxist theory does not lie in its concept of the relationship between social existence and consciousness, but in the reductionist concept of consciousness which brackets the particular content of individual consciousness and with it the subjective potential for revolution. This development was furthered by the interpretation of subjectivity as a bourgeoisie notion. Historically, this is questionable, but even in bourgeois society, insistence on the truth and right of inwardness is not really a bourgeoisie value. With the affirmation of the inwardness of subjectivity, the individual steps out of the network of exchange relationships and exchange values, withdraws from the reality of bourgeois society and enters into another dimension of existence. Indeed, this escape from reality rationality led to an experience which could and did become a powerful force in invalidating the actually prevailing bourgeois values, namely by shifting the locus of the individual's realization from the domain of the performance principle and the profit motive to that of the inner resources of the human being: passion, imagination, conscience. Moreover, withdrawal and retreat were not the last position. Subjectivity strove to break out of its inwardness into the material and intellectual culture. And today, in the totalitarian period, it has become of political value as a counterforce against aggressive and exploitative socialization. Liberating subjectivity constitutes itself in the inner history of the individuals, their own history which is not identical with their social existence. It is the particular history of their encounters, their passions, joys, and sorrows, experiences which are not necessarily grounded in their class situation, and which are not even comprehensible from this perspective. To be sure, the actual manifestations of their history are determined by their class situation, but this situation is not the ground of their fate, of that which happens to them. Especially in its non-material aspects, it explodes the class framework. It is all too easy to relegate love and hate, joy and sorrow, hope and despair to the domain of psychology, thereby removing them from the concerns of radical praxis. Indeed, in terms of political economy, they may not be the forces of production, but for every human being they are decisive, they constitute reality. Even its most distinguished representations, Marxist aesthetics had shared in the devaluation of subjectivity. Hence the preference for realism as the model of progressive art, the denigration of romanticism as simply reactionary, the denunciation of decadent art. In general, the embarrassment when confronted with the task of evaluating the aesthetic qualities of a work of art in terms other than class ideologies. I shall submit the following thesis: the radical qualities of art, that is to say, its indictment of the established reality and its invocation of the beautiful image, shone or shine, of liberation, are grounded precisely in the dimensions where art transcends its social determination and emancipates itself from the given universe of discourse and behavior while preserving its overwhelming presence. Thereby art creates the realm in which the subversion of experience proper to art becomes possible. The world formed by art is recognized as a reality which is suppressed and distorted in the given reality. This experience culminates in extreme situations of love and death, guilt and failure, but also joy, happiness, and fulfillment, which explode the given reality in the name of a truth normally denied or even unheard. The inner logic of the work of art terminates in the emergence of another reason, another sensibility, which defy the rationality and sensibility incorporated in the dominant social institutions. Under the law of the aesthetic form, the given reality is necessarily sublimated. The immediate content is stylized, the data are reshaped and reordered in accordance with the demands of the art form, which requires that even the representation of death and destruction invoke the need for hope, a need rooted in the new consciousness embodied in the work of art. Aesthetic sublimation makes for the affirmative, reconciling component of art, though it is at the same time a vehicle for the critical, negating function of art. The transcendence of immediate reality shatters the reified objectivity of established social relations and opens a new dimension of experience, rebirth of the rebellious subjectivity. Thus, on the basis of aesthetic sublimation, a desublimation takes place in the perception of individuals, in their feelings, judgments, thoughts, an invalidation of dominant norms, needs, and values. With all its affirmative ideological features, art remains a dissenting force. We can tentatively define aesthetic form as the result of the transformation of a given content, actual or historical, personal or social fact, into a self-contained whole, a poem, play, novel, etc. The work is thus taken out of the constant process of reality and assumes a significance and truth of its own. The aesthetic transformation is achieved through a reshaping of language, perception, and understanding, so that they reveal the essence of reality in its appearance, the repressed potentialities of man and nature. The work of art thus represents reality while accusing it. The critical function of art, its contribution to the struggle for liberation, resides in the aesthetic form. A work of art is authentic or true not by virtue of its content, i.e., the correct representation of social conditions, nor by its pure form, but by the content having become form. True, the aesthetic form removes art from the actuality of the class struggle, from actuality pure and simple. The aesthetic form constitutes the autonomy of art vis-à-vis the given. However, this dissociation does not produce false consciousness or mere illusion, but rather a counter-consciousness, negation of the realistic, conformist mind. Aesthetic form, autonomy, and truth are interrelated. Each is a socio-historical phenomena, and each transcends the social-historical arena. While the latter limits the autonomy of art, it does so without invalidating the trans-historical truths expressed in the work. The truth of art lies in its power to break the monopoly of established reality, i.e. of those who established it to define what is real. In this rupture, which is the achievement of the aesthetic form, the fictitious world of art appears as true reality. Art is committed to that perception of the world which alienates individuals from their functional existence and performance in society. It is committed to an emancipation of sensibility, imagination, and reason, in all spheres of subjectivity and objectivity. The aesthetic transformation becomes a vehicle of recognition and indictment. But this achievement presupposes a degree of autonomy which withdraws art from the mystifying power of the given and frees it for the expression of its own truth. Inasmuch as man and nature are constituted by an unfree society, their repressed and distorted potentialities can be represented only in an estranging form. The world of art is that of another reality principle, of estrangement, and only as estrangement does art fulfill a cognitive function. It communicates truths not communicable in any other language. It contradicts, however, the strong affirmative tendencies towards reconciliation with the established reality coexist with the rebellious ones. I shall try to show that they are not due to the specific class determination of art, but rather to the redeeming character of the catharsis. The catharsis itself is grounded in the power of aesthetic form to call fate by its name, to demystify its force, to give the word to the victims, the power of recognition which gives the individual a modicum of freedom and fulfillment in the realm of unfreedom. The interplay between the affirmation and the indictment of that which is, between ideology and truth, pertains to the very structure of art. But in the authentic works, the affirmation does not cancel the indictment. Reconciliation and hope still preserve the memory of things past. The affirmative character of art has yet another source. It is in the commitment of art to eros, the deep affirmation of the life instincts in their fight against instinctual and social oppression. The permanence of art, its historical immortality, throughout the millennia of destruction, bears witness to this commitment. Art stands under the law of the given while transgressing this law. The concept of art, as an essentially autonomous and negating productive force, contradicts the notion which sees art as performing an essentially dependent affirmative ideological function, that is to say, glorifying and absolving the existing society. Even the militant bourgeois literature of the 18th century remains ideological. The struggle of the ascending class with the nobility is primarily over issues of bourgeois morality. The lower classes play only a marginal role, if any. With a few notable exceptions, this literature is not one of class struggle. According to this point of view, the ideological character of art can be remedied today only by grounding art in revolutionary praxis, in the Weltanschauung of the proletariat. It has often been pointed out that this interpretation of art does not do justice to the views of Marx and Engels. The reification of Marxist aesthetics depreciates and distorts the truth expressed in this universe. It minimizes the cognitive function of art as ideology. For the radical potential of art lies precisely in its ideological character, in its transcendent relation to the basis. Ideology is not always mere ideology, false consciousness. The consciousness and the representation of truths, which appear as abstract in relation to the established process of production, are also ideological functions. Art presents one of these truths. As ideology, it opposes the given society. The autonomy of art contains the categorical imperative. Things must change. If the liberation of human beings and nature is to be possible at all, then the social nexus of destruction and submission must be broken. This does not mean that the revolution becomes thematic. On the contrary, in the aesthetically most perfect works, it does not. It seems that in these works, the necessity of revolution is presupposed as the a priori of art. The revolution is also, as it were, surpassed and questioned as to how far it responds to the anguish of the human being, as to how far it achieves a rupture with the past. Art's separation from the process of material production has enabled it to demystify the reality reproduced in this process. Art challenges the monopoly of the established reality to determine what is real, and it does so by creating a fictitious world, which is nevertheless more real than reality itself. To ascribe the nonconformist, autonomous qualities of art to aesthetic form is to place them outside engaged literature, outside the realm of praxis and production. Art has its own language and illuminates reality only through this other language. Moreover, art has its own dimension of affirmation and negation, a dimension which cannot be coordinated with the social process of production. If this translation is to pierce and comprehend the everyday reality, it must be subjected to aesthetic stylization. It must be made into a novel, play, or story in which every sentence has its own rhythm, its own weight. This stylization reveals the universal and the particular social situation, the ever-recurring, desiring subject in all objectivity. The revolution finds its limits and residue in this permanence which is preserved in art, preserved not as a piece of property, not as a bit of unchangeable nature, but as a remembrance of life past, remembrance of a life between illusion and reality, falsehood and truth, joy and death. By virtue of its transhistorical universal truths, art appeals to a consciousness which is not only that of a particular class, but that of human beings as a species being, developing all their life-enhancing faculties. Who is the subject of this consciousness? To be sure, the concept of the individual as developing freely in solidarity with others can become a reality only in a socialist society. But the fascist period and monopoly capitalism have decisively changed the political value of these concepts. The flight into inwardness and the insistence on a private sphere may well serve as bulwarks against a society which administers all dimensions of human existence. Inwardness and subjectivity may well become the inner and outer space for the subversion of experience, for the emergence of another universe. If the subversion of experience proper to art and the rebellion against the established reality principle contained in this subversion cannot be translated into political praxis, and if the radical potential of art lies precisely in this non-identity, then the question arises, how can this potential find valid representation in a work of art? And how can it become a factor in the transformation of consciousness? Neither is the truth of art a matter of style alone. There is in art an abstract, illusory autonomy, private, arbitrary invention of something new, a technique which remains extraneous to the content, or technique without content, form without matter. Such empty autonomy robs art of its own concreteness, which pays tribute to that which is, even in its negation. In its very elements, word, color, tone, art depends on the transmitted cultural material. Art shares it with the existing society, and no matter how much art overturns the ordinary meanings of words and images, the transfiguration is still that of a given material. This is the case even when the words are broken, when new ones are invented. Otherwise, all communication would be severed. This limitation of aesthetic autonomy is the condition under which art can become a social factor. Aesthetic form is not opposed to content, not even dialectically. In the work of art, form becomes content and vice versa. Not only poetry and drama, but also the realistic novel must transform the reality which is their material, in order to represent its essence as envisioned by art. Any historical reality can become the stage for such mimesis. The only requirement is that it must be stylized, subjected to aesthetic formation, and precisely this stylization allows the transvaluation of the norms of the established reality principle, desublimation on the basis of the original sublimation, dissolution of the social taboos, of the social management of Eros and Thanatos. Mimesis is representation through estrangement, subversion of consciousness. Experience is intensified to the breaking point. The intensification of perception can go as far as to distort things, so that the unspeakable is spoken, the otherwise invisible becomes visible, and the unbearable explodes. Thus, the aesthetic transformation turns into indictment, but also into a celebration of that which resists injustice and terror, and of that which can still be saved. The mimesis in literature occurs in the medium of language. It is tightened or loosened, forced to yield insights, otherwise obscured. The indictment does not exhaust itself in the recognition of evil. Art is also the promise of liberation. This promise, too, is a quality of aesthetic form, or more precisely, of the beautiful as a quality of aesthetic form. The promise is wrested from established reality. It invokes an image of the end of power, the appearance, shine of freedom. But only the appearance. Clearly, the fulfillment of this promise is not within the domain of art. In the transforming mimesis, the image of liberation is fractured by reality. If art were to promise that at the end good would triumph over evil, such a promise would be refuted by the historical truth. In reality, it is evil which triumphs. There are only islands of good where one can find refuge for a brief time. Authentic works of art are aware of this. They reject the promise made too easily. They refuse the unburdened, happy ending. They must reject it, for the realm of freedom lies beyond mimesis. The happy ending is the other of art. Cognition and experience are antagonistically divided, for art as illusion, shine, has cognitive content and function. Art's unique truth breaks with both everyday and holiday reality, which block a whole dimension of society and nature. Art is transcendence into this dimension where its autonomy constitutes itself as autonomy in contradiction. When art abandons this autonomy, and with it the aesthetic form in which the autonomy is expressed, art succumbs to that reality which it seeks to grasp and indict. While the abandonment of the aesthetic form may well provide the most immediate, most direct mirror of a society in which subjects and objects are shattered, atomized, robbed of their words and images, the rejection of the aesthetic sublimation turns such works into bits and pieces of the very society whose anti-art they want to be. Anti-art is self-defeating from the outsets. The various phases and trends of anti-art or non-art share a common assumption, namely that the modern period is characterized by a disintegration of reality, which renders any self-enclosed form, any attention of meaning, untrue, if not impossible.